Hello everyone. Now in this topic we will see the XenServer. XenServer, what is XenServer? XenServer is actually a virtualization hypervisor. It is a hypervisor which gives us the options to create and run virtual machines. Now we say, what is hypervisor? Hypervisor is actually a software or firmware which allow us to run, create virtual machines. It distributes the hardware, physical hardware to those virtual machines. It's kind of an operating system or kernel which will allow to create virtual machines directly on it. So XenServer is also a hypervisor. It's a kernel hypervisor which gives us the option to create and run the virtual machines on it. Now why we do this, why we create these virtual machines? It is actually a virtualization, which in term we also call we also say cloud computing. So cloud computings are getting very famous nowadays because it gives the organization options to have those hardwares which they are not able to get it to a physical hardware which they have to pay more money. So they can get it cheaply with these cloud providing services. So this XenServer is also a hypervisor, kernel hypervisor, which provide these cloud computing companies or cloud hosting services providers to make those virtual machines for distribution, for giving others. Now why it is getting famous? Because it is cheaper to use. Now for example, let's say if suppose you are the organizations, you want to have a virtual machine, you want to have a server. For example, you have organizations and in that you have multiple machines, Now you want to manage those machines, manage those infrastructure, then you need server. So what you need a server. So first you have to buy the physical server. Now when you buy the physical server, it pays, like you have to pay for it. It is not that cheap. It is expensive. Now when you get the physical server, then you have to make sure that you make a separate place for it, because it is going to run a multiple services, important services. It could have a multiple and important data for you. So you don't want everyone should have an access on this. So you have to make this server secure and separate from others. So what do? You have to make a space in your office that where you can keep this server. Provide electricity management, like it gets hot, so you have to have a cooling system for it. So you are going to pay enough amount of electricity also. Then the hardware, you have to manage the hardware. Hardware management, that means these hardware can get corrupt, sometimes this thing or sometimes that thing, like hardware like a RAM, processor or hard disk, whatever. So you have to keep managing this, maintaining this. So you have to maintain it, you have to keep it, you have to make a separate place. After purchasing, not only the purchasing you have to pay for the amount, enough amount you have to keep for managing this for every month. So it is not that easy to have the server in your office. So what we can do, instead of getting the physical server, we can go to these virtualization hosting services. They will give you what these providers, these vendors, there are many. They do what? They give you the virtual servers. So what we can do, we can just go to them and then we can ask them, like, we want this type of server, this will be the configurations and all that. So what they will do, these hosting services, the vendors, they will give you the virtual server. Actually, they will create the virtual server in that and they will give you the interface. Now you don't have to need any infrastructure, you don't have to create any separate infrastructure for that. You can access it on any machine and you can use that server. And then what you can install the operating system, whatever you want any application, you can install and use. So it will be very cheaper than having a physical server in your office. Very cheap, because they will ask you for the subscription and all that, and it is not that expensive that you have a physical server. You have to pay amount of money in every month, and that is not that expensive. It is not that expensive to have a server, physical server, and manage that server in your physical environment. So more and more people are going into this virtual environment. Now not only these servers, you can get many other services also. from these service providers, these vendors. Now what they do actually, they use a big server or multiple servers, and on those servers they install these hypervisors. They install these hypervisors and they do what? They create virtual machines on them. Virtual machines as their requirement, like someone requires something, so they create those virtual machines and give and distribute them to those different users who wants to pay for it. So we can get not only one virtual server, we can get any number of virtual server we want, and that is cheaper than having the physical server. Now this is what, because it is getting famous. Now within the organization also, like for example, we have an organization and what we want to have multiple servers. So for example, we have an organization and we want multiple servers, not only one, we want 10 servers. So instead of purchasing 10 different servers, physical servers, we can get one big server, and in that we can install the hypervisor, and then we can virtually create 10 servers what we want. So it will be also good for the on-premises servers, like this is like for on-premises, where we have to manage everything. And if you are getting the services from some vendor, then they will manage some of the part. Now managing also very important, that means the data, network and everything, you have to manage it, like you have to manage the data and everything, and that is managed by the vendor when you are getting it from somewhere else. Now in premises you have to manage everything. So this is also useful for on-premises use. So organizations, they want multiple servers, so they can get one, in price of one server they can get multiple virtual servers. So that is why these virtualizations are getting very famous. So this XenServer is also a hypervisor, but XenServer is actually a kernel hypervisor. Now I will explain what is kernel hypervisor. Now for example, let's say Hyper-V. So suppose we want to install the Hyper-V. Hyper-V, Windows Hyper-V is also a hypervisor. It's a hypervisor software. Now first what you need the hardware. Now in hardware you need RAM, processor, hard disk, networking, storage, everything. And in that hardware, what you have to do, you have to first install the operating system. Now operating system, in our case, for example, Windows. You have to install the operating system. Now remember, your hardware has to manage the operating system also. Then after the operating system, we install and enable the hypervisor, that is Hyper-V. Now in this case, that Hyper-V is installed on this operating system, Windows operating system. Now here what we have to do then, now we can do what? We can create virtual machines on these Hyper-V. Now our hardware first has to manage the operating system, that means first it has to process the operating system itself, and then on that operating system the hypervisor is running, and then you are running virtual machines also. Now the XenServer is what? It is fully virtualized. It is giving you fully virtualization. It is actually a kernel hypervisor. Now what the meaning of kernel hypervisor? First, kernel is what? Kernel is a core program of operating system which is interacting with the hardware and making the hardware work. So kernel is basically an operating system. So here in XenServer it is actually kernel hypervisor. So what it do? In your hardware you don't need any other operating system. You can do what? You can directly install the hypervisor on the hardware, and that is what? Your XenServer. So XenServer hypervisor is a kernel hypervisor. It's an operating system. Kernel means we can say it is an operating system. So it use what? It installed directly on hardware. Now in this case, and that in that XenServer, after that you can directly create the virtual machines. Now in this case, our hardware don't have to manage additional layers of operating system like here. So this operating system layer is removed. Directly we have a hypervisor which is running directly on the hardware, and we can create virtual machines on it. So our hardware don't have to process this extra operating system. It can have all the processing power in that virtual machines. And even this XenServer hypervisor is very small and light, It is not that heavy, where no graphical, nothing. It is just a command line text based interface. It gives you a text based operating system, we can say, and we can't, it doesn't use any more processing. All the processing of the hardware, all the processing power of the hardware will go for these virtual machines. So it is a good way, it is a good option we have. And that is why this XenServer is actually called the kernel hypervisor. Now, when we have a virtualization, so in virtualization we have different things. Now those different things, like first you have networking, storage, and the server. Like these things are the hardware related things. This is your all hardware. Then you have these different virtualization hypervisors. Then you create virtual machines, and in that virtual machines you can install the operating system, middleware, softwares and runtime softwares. Then you can put data and then applications. Middleware's runtime is like drivers and all that. And then you can have data and then you can have applications. So we can say this is what a virtual machine. Now, when we go for the virtualization, so you get three types of services. Three types of services like IaaS, PaaS and SaaS. IaaS means infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. Now these services differentiate the boundary that the vendor and the user can do whatever they want. Like it is a boundary, it decides the boundary between vendor and the user. Like if you are going for the vendor, if you are getting the services, virtualization services from the vendor, then these type of services defines that what is the boundary between the vendor who is giving the services and the user who is using the services. Now if you are using your own, like when you are creating a virtualization platform for your own premises, then everything will be managed by you yourself. So nothing is managed by vendor because there is no vendor. You are yourself creating the virtual machines for you in your own virtualization platform. But if you are getting the services, then you will get these three types of services from the vendors. So what are the three types of services? First, infrastructure as a service. Now infrastructure as a service, in this till here, everything will be managed by the vendor who is giving you the service. That means they will manage the networking, they will manage the physical networking, the storage which you need. So storage means they make sure that storage is always available. Whatever they do the redundant storage. They use the SAN, RAID, whatever they want. They have to provide a always available storage. So they have to decide like your storage must be available. Then whatever kind of server machine they want, they can decide and they can manage it. And on that, they can install whatever the virtualization platform, hypervisor. So they can decide like what they want, and they have to decide and they have to manage it. We don't have to care about anything here till here. Then what they will give us, they will just directly give us a virtual machine. Whatever we want, like we want this configuration, this number of processor, this number of RAM, this size of storage, whatever. So they will give us the virtual machine. Now in that virtual machine, this user, you have to manage. What you have to manage? What operating system you want to install it. So you will manage the operating system you install, whatever the middleware runtimes environment you want to give, like drivers and runtime environments you install. Then whatever the data you want to keep, you have to manage it here in your local, in your virtual machine. But actually the data is storing into this physical storage. So they will make sure that the storage data will be available. That means the virtual hard disk will be available every time. But in that virtual hard disk, whatever the data you are storing, you will be responsible for that data. They will be make sure that the hard disk will be, a virtual hard disk will be always available for this virtual machine. But in that hard disk, when you store the data, you have to make sure that data is there and you don't delete and whatever. You should take the backup also. Then whatever the application you want to install, you have to manage everything. But when you go for platform as a service, so in this, They will manage the hardware part, they will manage the virtualization also, then they will also manage the installation, operating system, drivers, middlewares and runtimes. They will manage everything here till runtime environment. Now you will just tell them that what kind of operating system you want, Linux, Windows, whatever. So they will give you that kind of operating system. You will ask for the operating system based on the application you want to install. So whatever the application you want to install, based on that you will ask for the operating system. So they will give you, and then you will use it on that. Now after that, whatever the data you want to have for the application, so application and the data for the application you have to manage. You have to make sure that application is running properly, and these data will be available for this application, and you have to manage all those things, this application and data for the application. Rest of the things, they will manage everything. Then you have SaaS, software as a service. Now software as a service means what? Everything will be managed by the vendor till the application. You will just get the application, you will get the interface of the application, and then you can use the application, pay the money. Simple. Like for example, Google give multiple SaaS services. When you go to Google, you will get Google Drive, you will get Google Photos, and now you will get Google Sheet, Google Doc. So you will get those application directly. So you store the data in that, you store the files in the drive, you store images in Photos, you create document files, Excel files in Google Sheet. So whatever you do, the application is available for you. You are using the application and you will pay. But Google is giving like free till the 15 GB, but after that you have to pay for it. There are many other services, there are many other SaaS services are available, like iCloud for Apple, Microsoft OneDrive, Business OneDrive, Office 365, Azure. So these are all cloud SaaS services. They give you the application and you use the application and you pay the subscription. So XenServer is what? It's a virtualization platform and it is a kernel hypervisor. So XenServer Architecture is the first thing. XenServer is a complete server virtualization platform from Citrix. Citrix is the company which is giving you the XenServer. The XenServer package contains all you need to create and manage a development of virtual x86 computers running on XenServer. Now, what XenServer is open source. Now, I told you that the kernel is basically the core program of the operating system. And that kernel of this XenServer is taken from the Linux. It is a Linux-based kernel. And the Linux-based kernels are all open source. So because of that, this XenServer is also open source. It is an open source virtualizing hypervisor with near native performance, and XenServer is optimized for both Windows and Linux virtual servers. That means in XenServer hypervisor we can create Windows machines and Linux machines both. But the kernel for the XenServer is taken from the Linux, and that is why it is open source. And open source means it is not free. It is not free, but nobody will force you to purchase it. So Citrix is giving you for money. They are having the editions which you have to pay for it, but with that you have a community edition also which is freely available with all the features, because it is open source. So open source is available as a community edition for everyone. Then XenServer runs directly on server hardware without requiring any underlying operating system. So as I said, it does not require any operating system to run for it. We can directly install it on the hardware and then we can create the virtual machines. So a VM, we can create what? The virtual machine. Virtual machines, what? Virtual machines, like it behaves exactly like a physical computer and contains its own virtual, like software based CPUs, RAM, hard disk and network interface cards. So virtual machines are basically the virtual machines like a physical computer, but it is a virtual. It has virtual devices like CPU, RAM and hard disk, which is isolated from the physical machine. Now why customer virtualize with XenServer? First, ease of use. It is ease of installation and configuration, no single point of failure, manage thousands of servers. No single point of failure means we can have multiple Xen servers combined together to work like a single entity. So we don't have single point of failure also. Then we can have thousands of virtual machines we can create. Performance, it will give you the enterprise class features like XenMotion, high availability, WB storage like XenMotion, vGPU, read cache. This optimized resources with zero downtime, desktop and cloud optimizing, or optimized for high density usage specification optimization. So this is performance is good. Then affordable also, it is affordable, it is innovative, market leading virtualization, and it is having apps and desktop virtualization also. So it gives you like savings per CPU socket pricing. When you go for the virtualization hypervisor, so it will ask you for per CPU pay, like whatever the hardware in your server, whatever the hardware CPUs you have, so you will get the license accordingly. So it is affordable, it is cheaper than the other virtualization platforms. Now what Citrix is giving, what additions we have. So in this XenServer, Citrix XenServer, we have two editions, standard and enterprise. Standard and enterprise. Standard edition is our entry level commercial offering, which are large of features, range of features which will suit for needs of 1,000 customers, those customers who want a robust and high performing virtualization platform but do not require the premium features offered by the enterprise edition. So while still wishing to benefit from assurance of comprehensive Citrix supports and maintenance. Then enterprise, when you go for the enterprise edition, it is a premium offering and it is optimized for both server, desktop and cloud workloads. And in addition with the standard edition, so whatever you get with the standard edition, it offers access to in-memory cache reading, dynamic workload balancing, GPU virtualization with NVIDIA Grid, VMware vSphere, XenServer conversion utility and Intel Secure Boot, and export resources data also. Now when you go for the pricing of these, so XenServer Enterprise Edition, again I said it is not free, but it is open source. But enterprise and standard editions are not free. You have to pay per CPU, like whatever the CPU you have, based on that you will pay based on the per CPU. So for automated enterprise-wide virtual environment, enterprise edition, this XenServer standard edition for automated, integrated and production-ready small to medium-sized enterprises, and it is having a less than this enterprise edition per CPU. Then another product for the Citrix is XenApp and XenDesktop. So if you get XenApp and XenDesktop entitlement, so it will available to XenApp and XenDesktop license holders. So XenServer will be also available to these XenApp and XenDesktop license holders with improved scale and performance and best TCO. Now this XenApp and XenDesktop is actually runs on XenServer. It is an application and it is used to do what? It is used to virtualize the application and desktop. Basically it is used for thin client environment, where you have a fat server and thin client, and in the client machine you don't have any hardware like RAM, processor, hard disk. You have only monitor, keyboard and mouse, and you connect through the network to the server, and from the server you share the desktop and also you share the application. Desktop applications are installed on the server, so all the processing and everything will run on server, and you just share the interface through the network to those thin client devices. And you can install this. The server will be the XenServer, and that you will use this XenApp and XenDesktop. Then you have XenServer Free Edition. Now this is freely downloadable via XenServer org and enterprise ready features with community support. Now this is same as Enterprise Edition. You will get all the features of Enterprise Edition, and it is free, and it is with community support. Now you will say, why we get this Enterprise Edition, expensive edition, if we have free edition available? So there is two reasons we have. Now first, if you go for the free edition, then Citrix will not give you any help and support. So if you go and have any problem with your server, if you face any problem with your server in a running environment, then what? If you are not able to solve the problem, then you can go for Citrix experts and engineers, and they will help you with this enterprise and standard edition. Now if you go for the free edition, then they will not help you. Now you will depend on the community to get the support. So you have to go for the community, and you go to the community blogs and then put your question like, I'm facing this problem. Then lots of people will give you the solution. Some work, some will not work. But in this, they will guarantee the support for you. That is why they are asking for this money. Now one more, the second thing is what? It is a community based version, and it is what? It keeps updates every time. Like everyone, community means the community of XenServer is keep working on it, and they can add new features into it as an update. Now suppose some features are not good and some features are good. So whatever the feature is new comes, whatever the new feature comes, first it will add it into this community edition directly, without checking its effects, like whether it is working properly or not. And if you are running with your community edition in a production server, then those features can harm your server also, because it is just like a testing. So when new features come, first it will update into community edition, and then what? They check, like we will say like what is the problem it is giving, and then we try to solve it, then problem, solve problem, then problem, solve problem. And then when we feel like it is a final feature is like now good and there is no problem in this feature, then actually that feature goes to this enterprise and standard edition. So it's keep improving. This community edition is for keep improving, and when it is fixed, like this feature is having a fixed stable server, so it goes to these enterprise and standard edition, those features. So basically it is the enterprise and the standard edition is the most stable edition you get, and this one is not that stable because it keeps updating with the new features. So these two problems, organizations don't want to use this community edition on directly the production server. They use the standard or enterprise edition basically. No matter you have to pay for it, but this will give you the stable operating system, stable hypervisor. So customers who have purchased the Xen app and Xen desktop continue to have an entitlement to XenServer also, because the Xen app and Xen desktop install on XenServer, which includes all the features contained within the standard edition and many of those in enterprise edition. That includes, these are the enterprise edition features like dynamic workload balancing. We can have a workload balancing on multiple servers, GPU virtualization with NVIDIA Grid. That means we can virtualize the graphic card also. In our physical server we have a graphic card, so we can virtualize the graphic card to give those virtual machines. Then VMware vSphere to XenServer conversion utilities. The VMware is again a different kernel virtualization coming from VMware company. So if we created the virtual machine in VMware Hypervisor, so we can convert that virtual machine into XenServer also. So you get the utility for that also. Intel secure measured boot, you get the secure boot, it will secure the booting. Then in-memory cache reading, and this one is actually for Xen app and Xen desktop. So it is only available in Xen app and Xen desktop Platinum edition only. So it is actually the feature which is used in this Xen app and Xen desktop. Now after that you have this architecture. This is our XenServer's architecture. So first we have hardware, physical hardware. Now in physical hardware you have the physical compute, network and storage. Compute means your RAM and processor, then you have all the physical network devices, and then you have the physical storage devices. All together it's your physical host. Now host means it's a physical server where you create the virtual machines. So the virtual machine, the physical server will call host, and the virtual machines which we create in that physical server, they are called guest. Remember the term host and guest. So host is the server where you create the virtual machine, and the virtual machine itself is a guest. So this is the physical host. Now in this hardware we directly install the Xen hypervisor. Is a kernel hypervisor. So it installs like an operating system directly on this hardware. Now, after installing the Xen hypervisor, what you will get is the virtual machines. You can create the virtual machines. Now, the first virtual machine which creates on XenServer, Xen hypervisor, is called DOM 0. Now, DOM 0 means domain 0, and this is the first virtual machine it creates on Xen hypervisor at the time of the installation. So, when we install the Xen hypervisor, it creates this virtual machine, DOM 0. And this DOM 0 is actually a Linux virtual machine. It is a Linux machine. So this DOM 0 is a Linux machine. It's a Linux operating system. But it creates on the virtual machine, first virtual machine, it is DOM 0. And in that, now this Linux virtual machine is used to manage and create the virtual machines on Xen hypervisor. It will give the interface where we can work on it and we can create and manage the virtual machines with the help of this DOM 0 Linux machine. It is an interface, it provides the interface. So it's a Linux, this DOM 0 is a Linux, but remember the XenServer is not Linux. So XenServer management and maintaining a XenServer, creating virtual machine and managing is different than the Linux. So Linux is different and XenServer is different. So whatever the XenServer management APIs we have, you have with this, you have installed into this Linux machine in Linux DOM 0. So this Xen API allow us to give those management tools, command line and graphical, so that we can manage and create these virtual machines. And to manage and create this, it uses the kernel virtualization of Linux. It is Chemo. This is the kernel virtualization of Chemo. It's a hypervisor, we can say Chemo hypervisor for the Linux virtualization. So it uses this to connect and manage these virtual machines with the help of Xen API. So in this virtual DOM 0, what you have the drivers to manage the hardware, physical hardware, and then these drivers are separated for each virtual machine by using these two options. In virtual machines you have driver fronts, and in your DOM 0 you have drivers back. So whatever the virtual hardware you have in these virtual machines like RAM, processor and hard disk and network, so your virtual machine give instruction to this driver front, then driver front forward the instruction to driver back. And the driver back will do what? It will forward the instruction to the main driver, which is used to work with this the physical hardwares. So physical hardware will work on it and then it will give the output to drivers back. And from here, from driver back, still here it is single driver, till here after the driver back it will separate the instruction from virtual machines to different virtual machines. So this driver back will separate the instruction to different virtual machines. So this is the architecture we have for the XenServer. So we have XenServer kernel hypervisor. On that it installs the kernel, the virtual machine DOM 0, the first virtual machine which is Linux, and it helps you to manage the virtual machine, manage the XenServer and virtual machines. And for that you have the Xen APIs. Then we have XenServer key component. So before going into the XenServer management, you should know the key component. So first is the XenServer itself. This is the server virtualization platform, that is the kernel hypervisor, and it is used to create and manage the virtual machines. We install this XenServer hypervisor directly on the physical machine, and then we can use we can create and manage the virtual machines on it. Now, to create and manage the virtual machines, we have another component which is XenCenter. Now, the XenCenter is a graphical Windows-based user interface. It's an application we can install in a Windows machine, and then from help of this XenCenter, we can manage the whole XenServer, whatever we want, like creating the pools, storage and deploying the virtual machines, managing, monitoring the virtual machines. We can do all of these by using this XenCenter graphical tool. Then the terminologies you should understand before going into managing this XenServer and virtual machines. So first, as I said, the host. Host is a physical computer that runs the XenServer. And guest means what? The virtual machines which we install on this XenServer host. So we call them virtual machines, and virtual machines is what? It is composed entirety of software that can run its own operating system and application as if it were a physical computer. And VM behaves exactly like a physical computer and contains its own virtual software based CPU, RAM, hard disk and network interface card. Now after this we will create the pool also. In XenServer we can create the pool for redundancy. That means the pool is what? It's a single managed entity that binds together multiple XenServer hosts and their VMs. So in single physical server we can have a problem, like if that the physical server goes down, all the virtual machines will not be available. So for this we can do what? We can create pool of multiple physical servers and their VMs. So we can do what? We can manage them properly and make sure that all the virtual machines will be available. Like if in the pool, the pool works like a single entity. So if in a pool, if one server goes down, then virtual machine of that XenServer will move to other XenServer hosts and they can run there. Then you have storage repositories. Storage repositories is like a container in which virtual disks are stored. So when we create the virtual machines, in every virtual machines we provide the hard disk, virtual hard disk. It feels like a real hard disk for the virtual machine, but it is actually software based virtual hard disk, which actually is stored into our XenServer storage. So the storage which keeps those virtual machines data is called storage repository in XenServer. It is like a container where all the virtual machines data will be stored, including the virtual hard disk and other configuration informations. And to administrating the XenServer, we have two options. We can use XenCenter, which is a graphical based Windows interface and Windows based graphical interface. Then we can use XenServer command line interface. So we can use a XenServer command line interface also. It allows to administrate XenServer using the Linux based Z commands. Now remember, Linux is different and XenServer is different. It is Linux based, but it runs with Z commands. So whatever you want to manage the XenServer, it always starts with Z. So the commands which we use to manage the XenServer, it always starts with Z. Apart from that, all the commands you run in that, it is the Linux command, because the DOM0 itself is a Linux machine. So this is just an introduction and architecture of XenServer. What is XenServer, what is the virtualization, and what we are going to do in this XenServer.